Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to be here with you to do this next expert chat. Today, we are going to be talking about sequencing to a peak pose, which is something we are both very passionate about.
Absolutely.
This is just a conversation. We get questions all the time about yoga sequencing. And of course, there are many different ways to do yoga sequencing, right? Some people sequence with the chakra system. Some people teach a set sequence of poses in something like Bikram or Ashtanga yoga. With Vinyasa yoga specifically, over time, despite there being many different styles of sequencing, we have really started to hone in on and become firm believers that sequencing to a peak pose is one of the best ways that you can show up and teach.
And I guess the way in which I think both of us came to this type of sequencing is that we did a 200-hour teacher training in which you're learning so many different things. You're learning about the poses themselves. You're learning about Western anatomy. You're learning about yoga philosophy. You're learning about all these different concepts, and at the same time learning how to teach yoga for the first time. So you don't get to spend a lot of time in your 200-hour teacher training really learning how to put a yoga class together, what poses work well with other poses. You really have to, you gain some of that knowledge by experience. So it wasn't really until I did my 300-hour training, and I think Kate would say the same, when she did her 300-hour training, where we started to hone in our focus on putting yoga classes together based around this peak pose concept.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing we should talk about is let's define what a peak pose is and
Sure.
briefly describe the style of sequencing for people. And then I'd love to hear, then I have a question for you after that. So okay. Why don't you take that one? Like, what, in our definition, what is a peak pose? And if you had to give the elevator pitch for this style of sequencing, what would it be?
Sure. It's really like the apex or a highlight of a class. And typically it's these big categories of poses: an arm balance, an inversion, or a back bend. But of course, depending on a level, it could be a standing pose as another category of poses. But the idea of it is that it's a pose that is a highlight, right? And everything you do in the class is really built around working towards that highlight in the class, followed by some type of teaching moment or demonstration where you're really bringing all the different elements of a class together in that moment, bringing your students together in that teaching moment to work on something that is a little more challenging than just a pose that you would do in every single class. And by doing so, it just really brings your students together in that moment, but also like highlights that teaching component of a yoga class, which I think is really important, separating movement from actually doing poses, and then teaching yoga as opposed to just choreography.
Yeah. So it's really, I think, in teaching to a peak pose, right? So it's, in a way, not always true, but it's physically the most challenging pose that you're going to do in a class, right? And so you use all of the poses before that to lay the groundwork, to set the foundation, to then eventually try out and practice this challenging peak pose. Yeah. And I think over time, it has become our belief, and what we have seen and why we are both so passionate about it is that, so background for a second. So I actually first experienced this concept of someone sequencing to a peak pose in your class when I was a student. So I was taking yoga classes at a studio that you were teaching at, and some teachers taught to a peak pose, some did not. And I was taking everyone's classes, and I think I had been practicing yoga at a gym prior to going to the studio. And I remember probably for like 2 years looking around and seeing like someone in crow pose or someone practicing handstand or full wheel. And it would be this thing where the teacher would just be like, and now it's time for crow, right? And like the people who could do crow pose would do crow, but I didn't know how to do crow pose. And there was no instruction on like, this is how to actually do the pose. Yeah. It was just like, if you can do it, you can do it. And I would look around longingly and be like, maybe one day I'll be able to do that. And then when I started taking your class, I remember actually like you demonstrating crow pose and demonstrating these poses. And I was like, oh, someone's teaching me how to actually try and work on these. And it was fun for me because I started to feel like I had hit a wall, and I was just going to forever not know how to do them. And then you started teaching how to, and then I was like, oh, I'm actually learning something and able to like move beyond that. And so I experienced it first as a student and really felt like it was a different way of teaching, and it worked for me as a student. And then when I did my 200-hour teacher training, I don't know if you remember this, you were not the lead teacher for that, but you taught like just sunset. I think you taught like one day on like a basic sequencing thing. And I had taken your class. So when I graduated my 200-hour, I did teach to a peak pose, in that I stopped and I taught a peak pose. But the rest of my class did not support said peak pose, right? Like I just like taught a sequence, and I'd be like, and now we're going to do this other big pose, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. And it doesn't mean that at that time, my class, I don't think was like well sequenced to support it, but I was like attempting to.
Yeah.
And I think, so that's the backstory. I first like liked it as a student. I tried it out as a teacher, and I found at that time that students liked it. They liked being able to actually take a time to look at that pose, but I didn't necessarily have a lot of success in like teaching them how to do the peak, right? Because my sequence didn't support it. And to your point, then when I did my 300-hour and we really doubled down on sequencing in a way where not just that we're teaching to a peak pose, but that the whole sequence is supporting that peak pose, that's also when I felt like my students got that same experience that I did, where they're like, I've tried to do crow for 3 years. I've never been able to do it. And finally today I did, because this thing that you said during triangle pose like made sense.
Yeah. I think you alluded to it. It's like one of the things when teaching to a peak pose and building your whole class around that is that you're doing repeatable actions that you're learning in simpler poses earlier on, and you're building upon those simpler poses and simpler actions along the way, so that when you get to a peak pose, like for example, crow pose, that you're putting those actions that you learned along the way all together in use to then apply it to a more challenging pose like crow pose, so that along the way you learn the actions that are necessary in order to get there. And if you are able to do it, you know why you were able to do it. Yes. So it's repeatable. That's a key thing. It's not like you did it one time and then the next 10 times you couldn't do it and you had no idea why you were able to do it the 10th time before. So in this way, they're repeatable actions that hopefully you can continue to put together so that you can do the pose over and over and over again. The second piece of it is that if you can't do the pose, it's okay, because you've learned the actions necessary in order to get to that peak pose, that if you can't do it today, if you continue to work on those same actions, you'll be able to do it sometime in the future. And I think that is a really key concept for student growth and for teaching students about actions and applying their knowledge and intelligence, how their body is moving in a certain way in order to accomplish something, in this case, doing a peak pose. There's also one other piece too, is like the concept of it, the idea of like Vinyasa Krama, which we haven't talked about, comes from this yoga master named Krishnamacharya, where he literally designed all his classes to have a clear beginning, middle, and end, leading towards a peak pose or apex in a class every single time he taught. So this concept really comes from his style of teaching, and we've kind of tried to carry and continue on that tradition in the way we teach asana and the poses.
Yeah. Which I think the other key piece is like, it puts you in the position in the friendliest way possible and the most accessible way possible to be truly the teacher in the room.
Yeah.
Right? Like where someone is coming to your class, either, assumingly they're paying, spending money, or some type of an exchange, donation based, whatever it is, to come and learn from you as the teacher. And I think so often then people consider themselves like guides, and I'm just going to take you through an experience. And that's one way of looking at things. But I also think if someone makes the effort to show up, exchange some type of energy, usually money, to come and take your class, like you owe it to them to teach them something, to actually let them learn something. And when we, in teaching to a peak pose and having that space where we stop, we demo, we instruct, this is what we're going to do today. Everybody look, we're working on crow pose, we're working on handstands. Now it's your turn. Then you as a teacher also have the chance to like go around and help your students in almost like a mini workshop format. It's like 5 minutes of a workshop in every class almost, where you can go around and say like, hey, Sally, like that looks so great. You need to come 2 inches further forward with your chest in order for your feet to lift in crow. And sometimes that's all it takes is like, then Sally goes 2 inches forward and now she's in crow pose and she's like, oh my gosh, this is the most exciting thing ever, right? And I think if every pose is just like worked always into the flow of a sequence and there isn't that actual stop, pause, let's teach to a peak pose, then as a teacher, we also don't get the opportunity to go and help our students in that way, right? Because then it's just like you're expected to move on to the next pose because somebody else is waiting. I think this sets up a structure where we can go in and support our students more fully, get that live feedback where they can ask questions in a way that doesn't feel like they're interrupting the class too. Yeah. And that's the other piece that I really like about it. I have found that it's the most supportive way to serve our students. It's the best way to safely build the rest of the sequence because all of it makes sense if it's leading up to this pose from an alignment perspective. And then for me, it was a confidence builder. Like I told you, I came out of that 200 hour and like kind of thought that I knew what I was doing because I sequenced to a peak. But because I didn't know how to put the rest of the class together, every time I'd be like, was that a good class? And sometimes it was, and sometimes truthfully, it wasn't, verified by students of mine who have noticed the difference since years ago when I made that change. Sometimes it wasn't a good class, and I never really knew why. Yeah. And I think when we committed to sequencing to a peak pose and allowing the whole class to support that, that's when for me I went, okay, I know that I can teach a solid class. I know that this is a good class. If someone doesn't like it, that's okay. I'm not their teacher. But I know that I'm like teaching a good, solid, safe class. So I feel like those things were really important in teaching to a peak pose also.
I agree. And, I've been thinking a lot too about this idea of like leading students in a direction. Mm-hmm. And, a teacher's job in a way is to take students and point them, mm-hmm. in a direction and to guide them along the way. And, in that moment of the demonstration, not all students are able to catch on with just the words that you're using, and in that moment of demonstration, you take that moment to pause, come watch, and they can see you actually putting into practice the things that you're asking them to do. Or if you're not doing the demonstration, you have another student do it. That's also really empowering because that visual aspect of seeing a student of yours, being able to do the things that you're asking them to do and put it all together is also really uplifting for the entire class. And I just love those moments when teaching and that feeling of accomplishment and putting into practice all the things that, that you hear in a class is just great.
And so I guess like the other follow-up thing is, so inside of our 200-hour course, we run through the sequencing skeleton of how to put together a sequence building towards a peak pose. We encourage students to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think the limitation that we have in any 200-hour, 300-hour training is that they have to be comprehensive, right? We're a Yoga Alliance certified program. There's a lot of other things that need to go in there. Yep. The deep dive that you and I have done over the years into sequencing, it's so nuanced and so detailed that to really learn all of the little components about how we put classes together to support that peak can't be accomplished in an initial comprehensive training. And so do you want to talk about our exciting, what we have, I guess, if this is of interest to you and you want to learn like how we actually put these sequences together to support the peak? Why don't you share what we have to offer?
I think also just saying that is like, it's not just like we're saying it as a sales thing. It's I think Kate and I started this conversation off saying that we did our 200 and it's impossible to learn the level and the depth of teaching in this way in a 200-hour, and we understand mm-hmm. that. And it was through further training in this method that we were able to like really put together a step-by-step method and clarify like how we take students along the journey to work on a peak pose. And
like we both chose 300-hour programs that were like advanced asana focused programs. But then even beyond that, we have gone further. So it's like something that like this didn't come from just being able to do those two comprehensive trainings. I think we went on, refined, tweaked, and like came up with our own system that we feel like supports that.
Yes.
And that's, I think, why we put this next, our Vinyasa sequencing lab, advanced sequencing course together.
Yeah, because so many students, and we've spent so many hours early on in our teaching career, like scrambling our heads about, writing a sequence down, spending hours and hours and hours putting a sequence together and not really knowing if it's going to be good or if it's not going to be good. So our sequencing course talks all about how to build your classes around the peak pose, and broken down by the different categories and the sections of a Vinyasa yoga class, starting with a warm-up and sun salutations, leading through your standing sequence, which is really important, part of any asana class, and then balance and twist section, leading towards a peak pose, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which is typically either a back bend arm balance or an inversion, Once that peak pose and the demonstration is complete, then talking about what happens after that class and the wind down. So we really dig deep into all these categories of poses and talk specifically how those categories are put together with the idea that this is the peak pose. So it's not just putting categories of poses together and then trying a peak pose. It's like, what is your peak pose? And then building every section around that idea of what that peak pose is. Not only the poses, but the cueing, the transitions, all the elements, so that your students will have the highest rate of success for the pose that you're asking them to.
Yeah. And so our new course, the Vinyasa Sequencing Lab, it's a sequencing course. It's to teach people the ins and outs, the nitty gritty of how to do this. And it has given us the opportunity to put a ton of focus time specifically on Vinyasa yoga class sequencing, right? And these larger trainings where you're learning about different styles of yoga and the subtle body and philosophy and all of those things that are super, super important for the foundation to become a yoga teacher. There just isn't the space to do a deep dive into the level of detail that we've done. And we wanted to distill that out for people who are Vinyasa teachers or want to be a Vinyasa teacher and want a systematic, repeatable way to build their classes every single time. So it is like a step-by-step formula to say, like, step one, this is how you build your warm-up. And also within that, these are the steps you take to build your warm-up. Yes. So every single thing is repeatable, systemized, and it's the way that we build our classes today. Patrick, just before our conversation, was like, I'm teaching in an hour or two. He's like, what are you teaching? And I actually was like, I'm not totally sure. I haven't thought about it. But that doesn't freak me out anymore because I can sit in 10 minutes and be like, this is the peak pose I'm going to teach. And I've been doing this long enough that I can just like walk it back, fit it into the system, and show up and teach. And I know it's a good class. It takes time to get to that point that you can do it in like 20 minutes, but it just is exciting to me because it removes the question marks. And that is like why we put this course, and the fear. Yeah. And that's what we're teaching inside of this course. So, I think that kind of wraps up the conversation on peak poses in general. Whether you decide that this course is a good fit for you or not, and you want to just explore the idea of teaching peak poses, we highly encourage it and have found in the years of experience that we have teaching that has been the most effective way to lead our students through solid yoga classes and give us like the peace of mind to know that we're doing a good job teaching.
Yeah. And I think it's probably for me, it's like the aspect of teaching yoga that I'm most passionate about. Yeah. And, the last almost 18 years of teaching, to really put all my focus into teaching good asana classes, Vinyasa yoga classes, because that is how I'm presenting yoga. And I think it's just an important piece, if that's how I'm presenting yoga, that it has to be a really, really important aspect of my classes. And so I think we really poured our heart and soul into the course. And I think the method is really solid, and you will get a lot out of it if you join us and hop in there with us.
Thanks for making me teach you a peak pose all those years ago.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for tuning in. We hope to see you soon.